Chapter 1. A little before 8 o'clock, at the close of a damp autumn day, a post-chaise entered Bath on the London road and presently drew up outside a house in Sydney Place. It was a hired vehicle, but it was drawn by 4 horses, and there was nothing in the appearance of the lady who occupied it to suggest that a private chaise, with her own postilions, would have been rather beyond her touch. She was accompanied by a middle-aged maid, and she was attired in an olive-green redingote of twilled silk, which so exactly fitted her admirable figure that any female, beholding it, would have recognized at a glance that it had been made for her by a modiste of the first stare. It combined the simplicity of a garment designed for travel with an elegance only rivaled by the hat which becomingly framed Miss Abigail Wendover's face. No curled plumes or bunches of flowers adorned this confection. It was made of gros de Naples, bound with a satin ribbon. Its poke was moderate and its crown shallow, but it was as fashionable as the redingote. The face beneath it was neither that of a girl in her first bloom, nor that of an accredited beauty, but it held an elusive charm which was centered in the lady's eyes, and the shy laughter which lurked in them. They were grey, and they held a great deal of intelligence. But her other features were not remarkable, her mouth being too large for beauty, her nose too far removed from the classical, and her chin rather too resolute. Her hair was neither fashionably dark nor angelically fair, but of a soft brown. It was not cropped after the prevailing mode. She wore it braided round her head, or in a knot from which curls fell about her ears. Occasionally, and in defiance of her niece's vehemently expressed disapproval, she tied a lace cap over it. Fanny said that it made her look like an old maid, and cried out indignantly when she answered in her pretty musical voice, "Well, I am an old maid." It seemed as if her arrival had been eagerly awaited, for hardly had the chaise drawn up than the door of the house which was her home was flung open, and a footman came hurrying out to let down the steps of the chaise. He was followed by an elderly butler who handed his mistress down, beaming a welcome and saying, "Good evening, Miss Abby." "Well, and it is a good evening which brings you home again. I am very happy to see you, ma'am." "Oh, and so happy as I am, Mitten," she responded. "I don't think I was ever away for so many weeks before. Is my sister well?" "Pretty stout, ma'am, barring a touch of rheumatism. She was a trifle down pin when you first went away, and took the notion into her head that she was of a consumptive habit." "Oh, no," exclaimed Abby in comical dismay. "No, ma'am," agreed Mitten. "It was no more than an epidemic cold, which left her with a little cough, as the new doctor was able to convince her." His tone was one of bland respect, but there was a twinkle in his eye which drew an involuntary chuckle from her. The twinkle deepened, but all he said was, "Very glad she will be to see you, Miss Abby. Quite on the fidgets she has been for hours past, fearing that there might be another put-off." "Then I must go up to her immediately," Abby said, and went with a light step into the house, leaving Mitten to extend a gracious welcome to her attendant. Since the struggle for position between the butler grown old in the service of the family and the one-time nurse to its 3 younger daughters was unremitting, Mrs. Grimston took this in bad part, detecting a note of patronage, and merely adjured him never to mind how she did, but to take care of Miss Abby's jewel box. Meanwhile, Abby, running up the stairs, found her sister awaiting her at the top of the first flight. Miss Wendover, enfolding her in a fond embrace, shed tears of joy, and begged her, in one tumbled speech, to retire instantly to bed after the fatigue of her journey, to come into the drawing-room, not to put herself to the trouble of uttering a word until she should be perfectly rested, and to tell her at once all about dear Jane and dear Mary and dear Jane's sweet new baby. 16 years separated the sisters, for they were the eldest and the youngest members of a numerous family, 3 of whom had died in infancy, and one, the firstborn son, when his only child was hardly out of leading strings. Between Selina, on the shady side of 40, and Abigail, with a mere 8 and 20 years in her dish, there now intervened only James, Mary, and Jane. It was with Jane, married to a man of considerable property in Huntingdonshire, that Abigail had been sojourning for the better part of the past 6 weeks, having been summoned to support her sister through the disasters which had befallen her. Measles had attacked her youthful family, and at the very moment when Nurse, falling down the back stairs, had broken her leg, and while she herself was in hourly expectation of presenting Sir Francis with a 4th petit paquet. In a letter heavy with underscorings, Lady Chesham had implored her dearest Abby to come to her at once, and to bring Grimston with her, since nothing could prevail upon her to abandon her beloved children to a strange nurse's care. So Abigail had posted away to Huntingdonshire, where she had remained for 5 weeks, under trying conditions, all 3 children having succumbed to the measles before her arrival, her sister being brought to bed within 2 days of it, and her brother-in-law, at no time remarkable for amiability, apparently labouring under the conviction that this unfortunate concatenation of circumstances had been designed for the express purpose of causing him to suffer the maximum amount of undeserved hardship. "You must be worn to a thread," Selina said, leading her into the drawing-room, "and then to be obliged to go to London in all that racket and bustle. I don't think Mary should have asked it of you." "She didn't. I invited myself, as a reward for not having got into a quarrel with Sir Francis. Never have I known a more glumpish, disagreeable man. I sincerely pity Jane and forgive her all her peevishness. You can't conceive how glad I was to see George's good-humoured countenance when I reached Brook Street, and to be made so welcome by him and Mary. I enjoyed myself very much and did a vast deal of shopping. Only wait until you see the bonnet I've brought for you. You will look charmingly in it. Then I bought ells of the prettiest muslins for Fanny, besides a quantity of fripperies for myself. But where is Fanny? She will be so vexed not to have been here to welcome you." "Fiddle, why should she be? It's Thursday, isn't it? Then I collect she is at the cotillion ball." "I thought there could be no objection," Selina said, a little defensively. Lady Weaverham invited her to dine and to go to the upper rooms afterwards in her party, and I consented to it, having then no apprehension that you would be with us again today. "Why, of course," said Abby. "Very uncivil of Fanny it would have been to have cried off." "Exactly so," said Selina eagerly. "With Lady Weaverham, to such an amiable woman, as I know you must agree. Besides having 2 daughters, which makes it so particularly kind in her to have invited Fanny, because it can't be denied that our dearest is the prettiest girl in Bath. Oh, out of cry. As for Lady Weaverham, no one could be more amiable or more shatterbrained. No, never mind. I'm glad she has taken Fanny to the ball on this occasion, for I must talk to you about Fanny." "Yes, my love, of course, but you are tired and must be longing to go to bed." "A bowl of broth." No, just a little thin gruel," said Abby, laughing at her. "You goose, I stopped to dine in Chippenham, and I'm not in the least tired." "Well, drink tea together as soon as I've put off my hat, and enjoy a comfortable prose," she added mischievously. "You look the picture of guilt, as though you were in dread of a scold. But how should I dare to scold my eldest sister? I'm not so brassy." She went away, leaving Selina to ring for the tea tray, and mounted the stairs to her bedroom, where she found Mrs. Grimston unpacking her trunk. A look of disapproval had settled on this formidable dame's countenance, and she greeted Miss Wendover with the information that she had known at the outset how it would be if Miss Fanny were left with only Miss Selina, and Betty Connor, who had more hair than wit, and was flighty into the bargain to take care of her. "Jauntering about all over," she said darkly. "Concerts and balls and theatres and picnics, and I don't know what more besides." Abby had her own reasons for suspecting that her niece had been enjoying far more license than had previously been granted to her. But, as she had no intention of discussing the matter with Mrs. Grimston, she merely replied, "Well, how should you?" which effectually reduced her old nurse to offended silence. The Mrs. Wendover had virtually had charge of their orphaned niece since she was 2 years old, when her mamma had died in giving birth to a stillborn son, and her papa had confided her to the care of her grandmamma. His own death, 3 years later, in no way affected this arrangement, and when, in Fanny's 12th year, her grandpapa had met with a fatal accident on the hunting field, and his widow had chosen to retire to Bath, instead of continuing to endure, in her dower house, a climate which had never agreed with her frail constitution, his surviving son, James, who was Fanny's guardian, had been only too glad to leave Fanny in her care. He was himself the father of a hopeful family, but his wife, a lady of forceful character, had no wish to assume the charge of his niece. When Mrs. Wendover died 3 years later, Fanny was bidding fair to become an uncommonly beautiful girl, and Mrs. James Wendover had even less desire to include her in her household, where she would not only outshine her cousins, but might even teach them to be as light at hand as she was herself. So James, steward and tenant of the estate of which Fanny was the owner, graciously informed his sisters that they might, for the present, continue to act as the dear child's guardians. It would be a pity, as his Cornelia pointed out to him, to interrupt her education at one of Bath's exclusive seminaries. James, adhering to the custom of his family, was determined to arrange an advantageous marriage for Fanny. But he thought there was time enough before it would become Cornelia's duty to launch her into society, not foreseeing that when Fanny was ripe for presentation, Cornelia would be more than ever determined to leave her with her aunts. Cornelia confessed that she could not like Fanny, in whom she detected a sad resemblance to her poor mamma. It was to be hoped that she would not grow into one of these modern hurly-burly females. But for her part, Cornelia considered that her vivacity led her to be far too coming. But what could one expect of a girl reared by a couple of doting old maids? The younger of the doting old maids went downstairs again to the drawing-room, where her sister was already seated behind the tea-table. Miss Wendover, after one glance at her carriage dress, with its rucked sleeves and its little winged ruff of starched muslin, greeted her with instant approval, exclaiming, "I never saw you look so becoming. London, of course?" "Yes, Mary was so obliging as to take me to her very own Therese, which I thought excessively good-natured of her." "Therese? I dare say it was shockingly dear then, because Cornelia once said to me so spiteful of her that it was to be hoped George might not be ruined by Mary's extravagance, and that she couldn't afford to have her dresses made by Therese." "Could, but won't," said Abby, sipping her tea. "How happy James must be to have a wife who is as big a nip-farthing as he is himself." "Oh, Abby, how can you? Remember, he is your brother." "I do, and never cease to regret it," retorted Abby. "Now don't, I beg of you, recite me a catalogue of his virtues, for they don't render him any more lovable less, in fact. Besides, he's an incorrigible busy-head, and I'm quite out of charity with him." Selina had been uttering soft clucking sounds of protest, but they ceased at this, and she demanded quite sharply, "Has James written to you too?" "Written to me? He actually came up to London to read me one of his pompous lectures. My dear, what have you been doing here? Who is this ramshackle youth who has been making up to Fanny?" "No such thing," declared Selina, her colour much heightened. "It was a case of love at first sight, and a very pretty-behaved young man. Only think of his running out of the pump-room with no umbrella to procure a chair for me, and becoming drenched, because you know what it is in Bath when it suddenly comes on to rain. there is never a chair or a hackney to be had, and I was persuaded he would take a chill, which would settle on his lungs. But he made nothing of it, so very obliging. And he had not then exchanged one word with Fanny, because she wasn't with me, and although I remembered that I had seen him in the upper rooms 3 days before, he did not, and Fanny was with me on that occasion. So if you are thinking that he got the chair for me because he wished to become acquainted with her, you are quite mistaken, Abby. If that had been his object, he would have desired Mr. King to have introduced him to us at the upper rooms. And, she concluded, with the air of one delivering a clincher, he is not a youth. I dare say he is as old as you are, and very likely older. Abby could not help laughing at this tangled speech, but she shook her head as well and sighed. "Oh, Selina, you goosecap." "I collect you mean to reproach me," said Selina, sitting very straight in her chair. "But why you should do so I haven't the least guess. For Fanny had a great many admirers before you went away, and when I said she was too young to be going to balls, you said I was Gothic, and also that she would enjoy her London come-out much more if she had previously been into society a little, which is perfectly true, because there is nothing so agonizing as to be fired off from the schoolroom, no matter how many dancing and deportment lessons one has had. Particularly if one is a trifle shy not. That I mean to say that Fanny is shy indeed. I sometimes wonder if she is not a little too, though never unbecomingly. And if James has been tattling to you, depend upon it that odious woman who is Cornelia's bosom piece, which is just what one would expect of Cornelia, to make a crony of a backbiting creature like Mrs. Ruscombe. Well, you may depend upon it that it was she who set him on, because Mr. Calverleigh never greets that tallow-faced daughter of hers with more than common civility, in spite of having been regularly introduced and receiving every encouragement to dangle after the girl. "Yes, very likely," agreed Abby. "There then," said Selina triumphantly. There was no immediate response to this, but, after a few moments, Abigail said, "If that were all, but it isn't, Selina. George isn't a backbiter, and he spoke of Calverleigh with the greatest contempt, because he thought it right to warn me that the young man is not at all the thing. Besides being a gamester, it seems that he is what they call a gazetted fortune hunter. In fact, the on dit is that Fanny is not the first heiress he has made up to. There was some silly girl who was ready to elope with him, if you please, only last year. Fortunately, the plot was discovered, and the whole affair hushed up." "I don't believe it," declared Selina, trembling with indignation. "No, and I wonder that George should repeat such steward's room gossip. Not the thing, indeed. I consider him most truly the gentleman, and of the first respectability, and so does everyone else in Bath. Oh, Selina, what a bouncer! You know very well that Lady Trevisian didn't hold him in high esteem. Indeed, she told Mary that she had warned you, just before she left Bath, that you would be wise to hint Calverleigh away. That was how George came to know about the business." Much flushed, Selina said, "I wonder that she could think of nothing better to do than to go tattlemongering all over London, making a mountain out of a molehill too, as I very soon discovered. Not that I mean to say that it was not very wrong of Fanny, and I assure you I told her so, and all because she saw Fanny walking with him in the Sydney Gardens, quite by accident, meeting him, I mean, and Betty with her, of course, at least she was then. So I gave Fanny a severe scold, and told her how shocking it would be if people thought she was fast. Yes, and I said that I was surprised at Mr. Calverleigh, which I collect she must have told him, because he paid me a morning visit the very next day to beg pardon, and to explain to me that this was the first time he had ever been to Bath, which accounted for his not knowing that it was quite improper for a young female of breeding to wander round the gardens, to say nothing of the labyrinth, without the vestige of a chaperone, not even her maid, because Fanny had sent Betty home, which was very naughty of her, most thoughtless, only she is such a child still that I'm persuaded she had no notion, and he, I promise you, felt it just as he ought." "Did he?" said the younger Miss Wendover rather dryly. "Well, you can't suppose that I mean to make a mountain out of a molehill. But the thing is, Selina, that however engaging Calverleigh may be, he will not do for Fanny. If George, who is far too good-natured to abuse people merely because he doesn't like them, calls him a loose fish, which I fancy means a libertine. Abby. Oh no, exclaims Selina, outraged. Well, there must be something very undesirable about him to bring James posting up to London in the greatest fuss imaginable. Yes, because he wants poor Fanny to make a brilliant match. I hope I know how to value my brother as I ought, but I must say that I think he has a maggot in his head on that subject. It was more than that, Abby said slowly, a frown creasing her brow. He seemed to me to be almost overpowered. Indeed, he couldn't utter the name without shuddering. I could have laughed if he hadn't put me so much out of temper, for what must he do when I asked him why he held Calverleigh in such violent dislike, but prim up his mouth and say that it was not a matter fit for my ears. I must be content to abide by his judgment, and if I did not nip the affair in the bud, there would be nothing for it but to remove Fanny from our care. What? Selina gasped. Don't fall into despair, my love, said Abby, smiling at her. He may talk of removing Fanny to his, or rather, her own home, but I fancy he would meet with some sturdy opposition from Cornelia. If he overbore it, I'm sure it would be for the first time in his life. It would be the cruelest thing. She would be miserable, uttered Selina in palpitating accents. Oh, she would run away, replied Abby cheerfully. I told him so, which gave him the chance to deplore her upbringing. However, before we got to actual dagger drawing, you should not. Oh dear, how often has dear mamma begged you not to be so impetuous? No, of course I should not, but there was no harm done because Mary was there, and I defy anyone to brangle in the teeth of her placid good sense. She said, in her sweetly comfortable way, you know, Selina, what a to-do was being made over a flirtation, which would never grow to serious proportions if James would but refrain from turning it into a grand tragedy, and so putting it into Fanny's head that she was a modern Juliet. James was a good deal struck by this, and so was I too. She broke off, perceiving that her sister did not share her sentiments. You don't agree? Her mild eyes filling with sentimental tears, Selina said in a trembling voice. How can you be so unfeeling? When you have said I don't know how many times that our darling should never be sacrificed as you were. When I recall your sufferings, when I think of your blighted life. Selina, have you run mad? Interrupted Abby, regarding her in astonishment. What sufferings? You may try to hoax me, but you won't make me believe that you have forgotten your anguish when Papa forbade poor Mr. Thornaby ever to approach you again. I shall never do so, declared Selina. Good gracious. The anxious look in Abby's eyes was put to rout by one of irrepressible merriment. My dearest goose, do try to forget it. I have, I promise you. Indeed, I haven't any very dear recollection of what he even looked like, though I do remember that I believed myself to be broken-hearted at the time. At 17, one does, only to discover that one has quite mistaken the matter. This sad want of sensibility daunted Selina for a moment, but she made a recover, saying, with an air of boundless understanding, You were always so brave, my dear one. But if you had forgotten Mr. Thornaby, why did you refuse Lord Broxboom's offer? So very flattering, and such an excellent man, with a most superior mind, and every quality to render him acceptable. Except one. He was a dead bore. Abby's eyes began to dance again. Have you been picturing me nursing a broken heart all these years? My dear, I do beg your pardon, but it is quite useless to make me the heroine of a tragic romance. I must always disappoint you. Next you will tell me that you too are determined to arrange a splendid match for poor little Fanny. I hope I know you rather too well to believe that. I hope you do. I may own that Papa chanced to be right when he sent Thornaby packing, but I still hold to it that this resolve he had, and my grandfather before him, and James after him, To arrange only the most advantageous marriages for every one of his children was nothing short of an obsession. And you may be sure I won't allow Fanny to be sacrificed as you and Jane were. Mary was so compliant as to fall in love with George, but only think of Jane, positively forced into marriage with that odious creature, who had nothing but his wealth and his title to recommend him. Selina, who had derived consolation all her life from the inculcated belief that Papa must know best, said feebly, "No, no. How can you say such things, Abby? One would think, not but what, perhaps sometimes he may have been a trifle. But I'm sure he did only what he believed to be right." "But for Papa," said Abby inexorably, "you would have married that curate, I forget his name, but I dare say you would have been very happy, with a quiverful of children and— Oh, dearest, forgive me. I didn't mean to make you cry." Selina had indeed dissolved into tears, but she wiped them away, saying, "No, no, it was only remembering, and even dear Mamma, who entered into all my feelings, couldn't conceal from me her apprehension that he would become bald before he was 40. It is you who should be pitied." "Not a bit of it. I don't regret Thornaby, and I was not sacrificed, as Jane was. No, and I won't let James make a burnt offering of Fanny either. That you may depend on. But, on the other hand, my dear, I won't, if I can prevent it, let her throw herself away on the first fortune hunter who makes up to her." "But I am persuaded he is no such thing," expostulated Selina. "He is possessed of considerable estates in Berkshire, and he comes of a most distinguished family. I believe he can trace his lineage back for hundreds of years. Well, I know nothing about his ancestors, but from all I have been able to discover, the present family is distinguished for profligacy and nothing else. This man's reputation is bad, and, according to James, his father was far from respectable, while as for his uncle, he, after having been expelled from Eton, seems to have gone his length in every extravagant folly, until he was packed off to India, under orders never to show his face to his family again. As for the estates, George says they are grossly encumbered, and if you think all these circumstances make Stacey Calverleigh an eligible suitor—" "Oh, no, no, no," Selina cried distressfully. "Only I can't believe that poor Mr. Calverleigh, and it always seems to me most unjust to visit the sins of the fathers upon the children, and when it comes to an uncle, positively wicked. Such engaging manners, and feels just as he ought, besides showing delicacy of mind and— Oh, I don't believe it." "Well, it was what George said, and you must allow that he is not at all prudish, as James is." She paused, her brow wrinkled in thought. "And I should suppose, wouldn't you, that a libertine must be engaging?" "Abby," gasped Selina, "I must beg of you to guard your tongue. If anyone were to hear you—" "Well, no one but you can hear me," Abby pointed out. "And all I said was, I know nothing about that class of person," interrupted Selina hastily. "No, nor do I," said Abby, on a note of regret. "Except what I've read, of course, and that diverting man who came to a ball the Ashendens gave, years ago. Papa said he would not permit a daughter of his to stand up for as much as one dance with such a fellow as that. Only I had already done so, and very agreeable it was. I don't know that he was a libertine, but I do know that he was a shocking flirt, and not because Roland told me so. In that consequential way of his, which made him look just like Papa, you know. It was evident that whatever Miss Wendover might have known, she was determined to forget. Summoning to her aid all the authority of her years, she said, in a voice of the gravest reproof, "Must I remind you, Abigail, that dear Roland is dead? No, and you need not remind me that he was our eldest brother either, or call me by that detestable name. Whatever else I might forgive Papa, that I never could. Abigail, Mashams and maidservants. Some people think it a charming name," said Selina, casting an arch look at her. "One of them is Canon Pinfold, who thinks you are charming too. He says that it is from the Hebrew and means father rejoiced. After a stunned moment, her unregenerate sister went into a peal of laughter. It was several minutes before she could do more than wail. Papa can't have known that. He wanted another son. And when she did manage to stop laughing, Selina's look of pained reproach very nearly set her off again. She bit her lip and said, a little shakily, "Don't mind me, you know what I am. And what in the world has all this to do with Fanny?" "Selina, I realise that you have a decided tendre for Calverleigh, but if he were the biggest prize on the matrimonial mart, I still should not like it." "Good God, do you wish her to plunge into marriage with the first man she has met, who is neither middle-aged nor a youth she has known since he was a schoolboy? At 17. I told her she was too young to be talking of having formed a lasting attachment," answered Selina, thrown upon the defensive again. "Yes, and I said that her uncle would never countenance it, and that she must put it out of her mind." This effectively banished any lingering desire in Abby to giggle. She exclaimed, "You didn't? Oh, Selina, I wish you had not." "You wish I had not?" echoed Selina, her voice as much as her countenance betraying her bewilderment. "But you have just said—" "Yes, yes, but don't you see?" Abby interrupted, only to break off her sentence abruptly as she realized the folly of expecting Selina to perceive what was so obvious to her own intelligence. She continued in a gentler voice, "I am afraid that it may have put up her backgrounds the independence of spirit which you have so often deplored. Yes, I know that you think she ought to submit meekly to the decrees of her guardian, but recollect that she hasn't been reared as we were, to regard the lightest pronouncement of a parenter, an aunt, as something it would be sacrilege to question and unthinkable to disobey." Roused to indignation, Selina retorted, "Well, I must say, Abby, for you to talk in such a way, when you never showed the least respect for Papa's judgment, and when I recall how often you came to cuffs with him, casting dear Mamma and me into agonies of apprehension. Well, not, dearest," she added hastily, "that I mean to say that you ever actually disobeyed Papa, for that I know you didn't." "No," agreed Abby in a flattened tone. "A very poor honey, wasn't I?" The mournful note startled Miss Wendover, but in a very few seconds she realized that it had its origin in fatigue, aggravated by anxiety. It was incumbent upon her to divert poor Abby's mind, and with this amiable intention she first told her, with an indulgent laugh, that she was a naughty puss, and then launched into a recital of the various events which had lately occurred in Bath. Her rambling discourse embraced such topics as what her new doctor said about Russian vapour baths, how eagerly dear Mrs. Greyshot was awaiting the return of her son from India if the poor young man survived the voyage, so ill as he had been in that horrid country. How much she was obliged to poor Laura Butterbank, who had spared no pains to cheer and support her during Abby's absence, coming every day to sit with her, and always so chatty and companionable, besides being charmed to execute any little commission in the town. But at this point she broke off to accuse her sister of not listening to a word she said. Abby had indeed been allowing the gentle stream of inanities to flow past her, but at this reproach she recalled her thoughts and said, "Yes, I am. Mrs. Greyshot, Miss Butterbank. I'm glad she bore you company while I was away, since Fanny seems not to have done so." "Good gracious, Abby, how you do take one up. No one could have been more attentive, the sweet child that she is. But with so much of her time occupied by her music lessons and the Italian class, besides having so many of her friends living here, who are forever inviting her to join them for a country walk or some picnic party, perfectly unexceptionable. I'm sure it is not to be wondered at. I mean, when Laura gave me the pleasure of her company every day, there was no reason why Fanny should have stayed at home, and very selfish it would have been in me to have asked it of her. Yes, and most unnatural it would be if she didn't wish to be with girls of her own age. True, or even with the fascinating Calverleigh. Now, Abby. Well, it would be, said Abby candidly, Any girl would prefer the company of a taking young man to that of her aunt. But it won't do, Selina. I am persuaded that when you have made his acquaintance, not that I would for a moment encourage her, oh dear, how very affecting it is. You will have to tell her, for I know I could never bring myself to do so. Dearest, it isn't so dreadful that you need fall into affliction. It's certainly unfortunate, and I wish with all my heart that she might have been spared such a painful disappointment, but shall recover from it. As for forbidding her to see Calverleigh, or telling her the things that are said of him, I'm not such a widgeon. She would fly to his defence. But if he were to draw off, not compelled to do so, but because he discovered her to be not such a rich plum as he had supposed, she might suffer a little unhappiness, but not for long. She's not the girl to wear the willow for a mere flirt, she added thoughtfully, and she couldn't, under those circumstances, fancy herself to be a star-crossed lover, could she? I do feel that that should be avoided at all costs, for although I've never been star-crossed myself, I can readily perceive how romantic it would be. Selina, I never knew Fanny's mother at all well, but you must have done so. Was she high-spirited, like Fanny? Rather too dashing, perhaps, to suit the Wendover notions of propriety. Celia? Good gracious, no, replied Selina. She was very pretty, quite lovely, when she was a girl, but she went off sadly, which I do hope and pray Fanny won't, because she is very like her in countenance, and Mamma always was used to say that fair beauties seldom wear well. But Fanny isn't in the least like her in disposition. She has so much liveliness, and poor Celia was a very quiet, shy girl, and most persuadable. What makes you ask me about her? Something James said. I wasn't paying much heed, but it was something about Fanny's too close resemblance to her mother. And then he stopped short, and when I asked him what he meant, he fobbed me off, saying that Fanny was as foolish as her mother. But I didn't think he did mean that, and nor did Mary. She remembers more than I do, of course, and she tells me that you elder ones always thought that something had happened, some indiscretion, perhaps. I never thought any such thing, intervened Selina firmly, and if I had, I should have considered it most improper to have pried into it. If Mamma had wished me to know anything about it, she would have told me. So there was something, said Abby, a skeleton in our respectable cupboard. I wish I could know what it was, but I dare say it would prove to be no more than the skeleton of a mouse. Chapter 2. Not long after 11 o'clock that evening, a gentle tap on the door of Abby's bedchamber was followed immediately by the entrance of Miss Fanny Wendover, who first peeped cautiously into the room, and then, when she saw her aunt seated at the dressing-table, uttered a joyful squeak and ran to fling herself into the arms held out to her, exclaiming, "You aren't in bed and asleep. I told Grimston you wouldn't be. Oh, how glad I am to see you again. How much I've missed you, dear, dear Abby." It would not have surprised Abby if she had been greeted with reserve, even with the wary, half-defiant manner of one expectant of censure and ready to defend herself. But there was no trace of consciousness in the welcome accorded her, and nothing but affection in the beautiful eyes which, as Fanny sank down at her feet, clasping her hands, were raised so innocently to hers. "It's horrid without you," Fanny said, giving her hands a squeeze. "You can't think." Abby bent to drop a kiss on her cheek, but said with mock sympathy, "My poor darling, so strict and unkind as Aunt Selina has been. I feared it would be so." "That's what I've missed so much," Fanny said, with a ripple of mirth. "I am most sincerely attached to Aunt Selina, but she is not a great jokesmith, is she? And not a bit corky." "I shouldn't think so," responded Abby cautiously. "Not that I know what corky means, but it sounds very unlike Selina, and, I may add, sadly unlike the language to be expected of a girl of genteel upbringing." That made Fanny's eyes dance. "Yes, slang. It means, oh, bright and lively, like you. Does it indeed? I collect you mean to pay me a handsome compliment, but if ever you dare to attach such an epithet to me again, Fanny, I shall, well, I don't yet know what I shall do, but you may depend upon it that it will be something terrible. Corky, good God! I won't, Fanny promised. Now do be serious, beloved. I have so much to tell you. Something of the first importance. Abby knew a craven impulse to fob her off, but subdued it, saying in what she hoped was not a hollow voice, "No, have you? Then I will engage to be perfectly serious. What is it?" Fanny directed a searching look at her. "Didn't Aunt Selina, or Uncle James perhaps, tell you about Mr. Calverleigh?" "About Mr.? Oh, is he the London smart you've slain with one dart from your eyes?" "To be sure they did, and very diverting I thought them." "That is to say," she corrected herself, in a ludicrously severe tone, "that of course they are very right in thinking you to be far too young to be setting up a flirt. Most forward of you, my love, quite improper." She won no answering gleam. "It isn't like that," Fanny said. "From the very first moment that we met—" She paused and drew a long breath. "We loved one another," she blurted out. Abby had not expected such an open avowal, and could think of nothing to say but that it sounded like a fairy tale, which was not at all what she ought to have said, as she realized an instant later. Raising glowing eyes to her face, Fanny said simply, "Yes, it is just like that. Oh, I knew you would understand, dearest, even though you haven't yet met him, and when you do meet him, oh, you will dote on him. I only wish you may not cut me out." Abby accorded this sally the tribute of a smile, but recommended her ecstatic niece not to be a pea-goose. "Oh, I was only funning," Fanny assured her. "The thing is that he isn't a silly boy like Jack Weaverham or Charlie Ruscombe or Peter Trevisian, but a man of the world and much older than I am, which makes it so particularly gratifying. No, I don't mean that. So wonderful that in spite of having been on the town, as they say, for years and years, he never met anyone with whom he wished to form a lasting connection until he came to Bath and met me." Overcome by this reflection, she buried her face in Abby's lap, saying in muffled accents, "And he must have met much prettier girls than I, and don't you think?" Miss Wendover, aware that her besetting sin was a tendency to give utterance to the first thought which sprang to her mind, swallowed an impulse to retort, but few so well endowed, and replied instead, "Well, as I'm not acquainted with any of the latest beauties, I can't say. But to have made a London beau your first victim is certainly a triumph. Of course, I know I shouldn't say that to you. Your Aunt Cornelia would call it administering to your vanity. So pray don't expose me to her censure by growing puffed up, my darling." Fanny looked up. "Ah, you don't understand. Abby, this is a lasting attachment. You must believe that. Has my uncle told you that he is a desperate flirt? Such a sad reputation as he has. He told me so himself, but I don't care a rush because, although he has frequently fancied himself to be in love, he never wished to marry anyone until he met me. And if my uncle said that he is a trifle rackety, he might have spared his breath, for Stacey told me that too. He said, oh, Abby, he said he wasn't fit to touch my hand. And no one could blame my uncle if he refused to give his consent to our marriage." She once more hid her face in Abby's lap, raising it again to add, "So you see?" Abby thought that she did, but she only said, stroking the golden head on her knee, "But what is there in all this to cast you into agitation? Anyone would suppose that your uncle had already refused his consent, and had threatened you both with dire penalties into the bargain." "Oh," breathed Fanny, looking eagerly up at her. "Do you mean that you think he won't refuse it?" "Oh no," said Abby. "I am very sure that he will. And although I have no very high opinion of his judgment, I give him credit for not being such a niddercock as to accept the first offer made to him for your hand. A pretty guardian he would be if he allowed you to become riveted before your first season. Yes, I know that sets up all your bristles, my darling, and makes you ready to pull caps with me, but I beg you won't. Your uncle may dream of a splendid alliance for you, but you know that I don't. I only dream of a happy one. I know, oh, I know, Fanny declared. And so you will support me? Best of my aunts, say that you will. Why, yes, if you can convince me that your first love will also be your last love. But I have told you, Fanny said, sitting back on her heels and staring at her in rising indignation. I could never love anyone as I love Stacy. Good God, how can you talk like that to me? I know, my aunt told me. How my grandfather repulsed the man you loved. And you've never loved another, and your life was ruined. Well, I thought so at the time, Abby admitted. A smile quivered at the corners of her mouth. I must own, however, that whenever that first suitor of mine is recalled to my mind, I can only be thankful that your grandfather did repulse him. You know, Fanny, the melancholy truth is that one's first love very rarely bears the least resemblance to one's last and most enduring love. He is the man one marries and with whom one lives happily ever after. But you have not married, muttered Fanny rebelliously. Very true, but not because I carried a broken heart in my bosom. I have fallen in and out of love a dozen times, I dare say. And as for your Aunt Mary, she, you know, was always accounted the beauty of the family, and you might have reckoned her suitors by the score. The first of them was as unlike your Uncle George as any man could be. I thought that my grandfather had arranged that marriage, interpolated Fanny. Oh, no, replied Abby. He certainly approved of it. But George was only one of 3 eligible suitors. He was neither the most handsome nor the most dashing of them, and he bore not the smallest resemblance to any of your aunt's first loves. But theirs is a very happy marriage, I promise you. Yes, but I am not like my aunt, returned Fanny. I dare say she would have been as happy with any other amiable man, because she has a happy disposition, besides being very, very conformable. She twinkled naughtily up at Abby, which I am not. My aunt is like, a deliriously soft cushion, which may be pushed and pummeled into any shape you choose. But I know what I want, and have a great deal of resolution into the bargain. More like a bolster, in fact, agreed Abby, with an affability she was far from feeling. Fanny laughed. Yes, if you like. Worst of my aunts. In any event, I mean to marry Stacy Calverleigh, whatever my uncle may say or do. Well aware that few things were more invigorating to high-spirited adolescence than opposition, Abby replied instantly. Oh, certainly. But your father, you know, was an excellent dragsman, and he was used to say that you should always get over heavy ground as light as possible. I am strongly of the opinion that you and Mr. Calverleigh should refrain from declaring your intentions to your uncle until you can also present him with proof of the durability of your attachment. He wouldn't care. You must know he wouldn't. And if you mean to say that I must wait until I come of age, oh no, you couldn't be so heartless. 4 whole years. When you have met Stacy, you will understand. I shall be delighted to meet him and wish it may be soon. Oh, and so do I, Fanny said eagerly. You can't think how much I miss him. You see, he was obliged to go to London, but he said it would only be for a few days, so he may be in Bath again by the end of the week. Or, at any rate, next week. That you may depend on. This was said with a radiant look, and was followed by a shyly ecstatic account of Fanny's first meeting with Mr. Calverleigh, and a description of his manifold charms. Abby listened and commented suitably, but seized the first opportunity that offered of turning Fanny's thoughts into another channel. She directed her attention to the pile of dress lengths she had procured in London and bade her say if she liked them. This answered very well, and in going into raptures over a spider gauze, wondering whether to have a celestial blue crepe trimmed with ribbon or puff muslin, and arguing with Abby over the respective merits of Circassian or cottage sleeves for a morning dress, Fanny temporarily forgot Mr. Calverleigh and went off to bed presently to dream, Abby hoped, of fashions. It seemed on the following morning as though she had done so, for she visited her aunt before Abby was out of bed, eager to show her several fashion plates from the latest issue of the Ladies' Home Journal, and hopeful of coaxing her to sally forth before breakfast on a visit to the dressmaker on South Parade. In this she failed, Abby pointing out to her that her Aunt Selina, no early riser, would be very much hurt if excluded from the expedition. She added a reminder that in all matters of taste and fashion, Selina was infallible. Fanny pouted but submitted, knowing the truth of this dictum. She might stigmatize many of Selina's notions as fusty, but no one had ever cast a slur on Selina's eye for the elegant and the becoming. In her youth, she had been the least good-looking, but the most modish of the Wendover girls. In her middle age, and endowed with an easy competence, she enjoyed the reputation of being the best-dressed woman in Bath. If Fanny did not, like Abby, seek her advice, she was shrewd enough to respect her judgment, so that when, presently, she showed Selina the sketch of a grossly over-trimmed walking dress, her secret longing to be seen abroad in this confection was nipped in the bud by Selina's devastating criticism. "Oh dear," said Selina, wrinkling her nose in distaste. "All those frills and tucks and ribbons. So deedy." So nothing more was seen of that fashion plate, and in due course all three ladies set out in Miss Wendover's new barouche for South Parade, where Madame Lisette's elegant showrooms were situated. Madame Lisette, who was born Eliza Mudford, enjoyed royal patronage, but although she was the particular protégée of the Princess Elizabeth, in whose service she had started her career, and rarely failed to receive orders from Bath's noblest and most fashionable visitors, the Mrs. Wendover ranked high amongst her favourite clients. They were rich, they were resident, and they set off to the greatest advantage the fruits of her genius. By no means all her customers were honoured by her personal attention, but no sooner had her head saleswoman caught sight of the barouche drawing up outside the door than she sent an apprentice scurrying upstairs to Madame's office with the news that the Mrs. Wendover were about to enter the shop. So, by the time the Mrs. Wendover had inquired kindly after Miss Snisby's health, and their footman had delivered into the care of an underling the package containing the silks and the gauzes and the muslins purchased in London by Miss Abigail, Miss Mudford had arrived on the scene, suitably but exquisitely gowned, in a robe of rich silk but sober